straight into it. I've got about half an hour or so before everyone comes into work and this place becomes too noisy to operate. So organisational structure. We're getting close to the end of the course. A lot of you, most of you, will have got back your major assignment, the 3,000 word piece, and yeah, interesting response in terms of how you feel you went. I've tried to explain my reasoning for the marks that I've given, and no doubt the lecturers that have marked your work, if it wasn't me, have done the same. Yeah, feel free to talk to your lecturers for further details about where you went right and where you went wrong. But one thing I do really urge you to pay attention to is the document that I will be sending out before the end of the semester to all of you who have handed in work, giving details of how to improve your work for future semesters. It's like a 5-page document. Some of you have already have received it, but for future semesters, this could be really very useful. It's certainly the best I can do in terms of advising you on how to do significantly better in future courses at CQU. Right, let's get into the topic. It's not a hugely big one, but organisational structure is kind of how you set up a business in terms of dividing labour up, deciding who works where, patterns of coordinating, management structures, how you communicate, formal power structures, all that sort of stuff. It's actually kind of like you don't see it. It's almost organisational structure is almost invisible within within a company, but it has some, as we'll see, powerful impacts on how things operate within the company. So, division of labour, the classic one. I will play a little bit of this from Henry Ford.
In Britain, the Vulcan Motor Company was proud to film the way their workers assembled cars, slowly and carefully by hand. Craftsmen worked in their own way, at their own pace. The whole process took several weeks from start to finish. These handmade cars were so expensive that a wide gulf separated those who built them from those who bought them. But the days when cars were just luxuries for the rich were drawing to a close. In 1908, one man's vision would change manufacturing and create a new market. Henry Ford set out to make the simplest car ever. A car for rural America, a 20th century equivalent of the horse and buggy. To produce the Model T cheaply, Ford knew he had to change the way cars were built.
And so, I urge you to actually look up Taylorism and Ford, and you'll be able to find this clip in full on YouTube. But some of the key points that emerge from this, and if I could turn the volume, let's see, I should be able to play that. Turn the volume down, and I'll be able to talk over the top of it, just speed things up a little bit. Ford was the first to introduce into automotive manufacturing, at least, mass production. And what they did was they took this guy, Taylor, I think William Taylor, who coined whose name has been given to the process of Taylorism, where you break work up into small components. And the great thing about breaking work up into small components is that you can de-skill highly complex jobs. So in the past, for example, making the wheel, as we'll see in a moment, making the wheel of a Ford motor car is a highly complex wheel. Wainwrights, I think they were called in the old days. Wainwrights would be able to curve wood and drill the holes and assemble the wheels that were nicely aligned and balanced. With a highly skilled task. But if you break it up into just shaving a little bit off this, or one person spends all day bending, that people of relatively low skill can become quite adept at doing highly complex tasks. Or in the case of Taylorism, this is the world's fastest typist. She managed to do 150 words a minute, and Taylor actually claimed responsibility for that by breaking even typing up into small components to show how it could also be atomized and then accelerate it. As you can see here, the guys are all doing one task rather than many different tasks. Secondly, of course, the speed advantages. If you apply pressure to someone who's doing a simple job, we've talked about this before, the Yerkes-Dodson law, how if you apply pressure to a person doing a complex job, eventually the pressure will start to tell and they'll slow down. At a certain level you need some arousal, but at a certain level that arousal becomes too great. But with these kind of tasks, very, very simple tasks, the more pressure you apply to people, the more incentives or bonuses you apply for them to go faster, the faster they go. And that's wonderful for manufacturers and their profitability. So the way cars were manufactured at this stage is you brought the parts, as you can see here, you brought the parts to the car and you holistically assembled the car in the one spot. And Ford decided to change this radically, and this really did revolutionize automotive manufacturing and drop the price of vehicles effectively to a level where ordinary, farmers and ordinary folk could afford it, and the employees at the Ford Motor Factory indeed could afford to buy it. And this is a reenactment of an early trial where he had this strong guy pulling the trolley, pulling the chassis, and guys would then just stand still. The car would move and the guys would stand still and pull stuff, put stuff onto it, and then the car would move forward again. This process, the conveyor belt, or the automation of the conveyor belt system, revolutionized manufacturing. It also caused incredible stress on staff because the automation would decide how quickly you manufactured a car, not you. The car was not finished when you were finished with it. The car was finished when it moved on. You had to match the machine, and that caused a lot of stress to workers and very high staff turnover. However, what Ford did fairly radically is just double the wages. In one fell swoop, he doubled the wages to a level where they had workers pounding, or would-be workers pounding on the doors looking for jobs at the Ford Motor Factory. Doesn't make them any more satisfying as work, and some of the large car manufacturers have started to reverse this process. Anyway, and start to, some of the luxury car manufacturers have started to create little teams that have responsibility for, let's say, some identifiable part of the work that you can take pride in. Because how much pride can you take in screw, 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 do the same thing, screw, 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 all the same? You can't see what you're doing. You're only focusing on that one part of the thing, which does create a lot of stress and lack of pride in work, which reduces engagement and reduces things like innovation, for example, a desire to improve. So dividing labour does increase efficiency, makes people easier to manage because they're only doing one thing. It reduces the training cost, as you can imagine. You don't have to train them in the whole process. You train each person in one process, highly efficient. And in theory, it allows staff to do the things they're good at, but in practice, it allows everyone to be good at almost anything, as long as you break it up into a small enough component. So the way we coordinate work activities in this kind of situation is through communication, whether formal or informal, and we'll be talking about these hierarchies, systems, bureaucracies and managerial structures in this chapter, and also through these standardization procedures, which we just had a quick look at. This informal communication tends to be particularly important, as we've sort of hinted at in previous chapters, particularly important in complex, ambiguous and sort of non-routine, one-off activities. And we talked also in that communication chapter about the aspects of media richness as a concept, and something that may come up in the exam, as I've hinted. Media richness, for example, in this particular video, I'm giving you the slides, visual, auditory from my voice. There's the written material there. There's my body language that you can see on the screen. So that's an example of a highly media-rich form of communication. I want to talk particularly about the formal hierarchy within these organisations, where you actually structure a company very, very rigidly. It does make it efficient and predictable, but it also is non-responsive to environmental changes. So it tends to be hard to change, sluggish. You get some kind of residual built-in inertia that stops the organisation from changing. That's one of the negatives of the hierarchy. It also tends to be expensive, having formal systems in place. And we'll talk about that also. Policies, for example, plans and policies, rules and regulations, paperwork, bureaucracy. It all takes time, money, and it's also disempowering. However, when you use informal methods, it does, of course, become messy and difficult in its own way, but it is highly responsible and often quite cheap and makes people feel engaged and involved. Public service manual on how to cut paperwork. If you want to watch great examples of this bureaucracy and formal hierarchy in action, watch Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, the British TV comedies. They're a bit dated now, but believe me, they're still documentary. They're almost like documentaries of how politics operates. And the issue of standardisation, we just talked about that briefly with the Ford Motor Company. You can standardise processes, you can standardise outputs, and by that we mean limiting limiting the outputs that you come out of a company and making them highly defined, measurable. The process here does standardizing outputs and defining quality, etc. These are often client-orientated processes, but they're client-orientated in two ways: quality and predictability from the client's point of view, but also price. So if you have a line of hundreds of different products, supporting that line as a manufacturer or an agent or a wholesaler can be quite a lot of work, whereas supporting a more narrow range of line allows you to have less warehousing costs, less production costs, less labelling costs, and enables you to pass some of those savings on to the client. You can also standardise skills, and you see that in job ads sometimes as incredibly narrow definitions of what people want out of people. Okay, let's quickly look at some key concepts. Departmentalisation, we're all familiar with this: the Department of Design, Sales Department, HR Department. These are how activities are organised. Employees within an organisation who do a single thing are grouped together. This issue of span of control. Effectively, as it says there, that's the number of people directly reporting to the next level up. You have two kinds of spans of control. Excuse me. And that can include tall structures and flat structures, and we'll briefly mention them in a minute. But effectively, small companies often have very flat structures. Boss with everybody who works underneath them. Whereas, for example, the army is a great example of a very tall structure with a very flat bottom, lots of grassroots soldiers or sailors, or Air Force workers at the bottom level, but a very, very tall structure of all the way up to generals and vice air marshals, etc., up the top. And then this issue of centralisation, the degree to which power in an organisation rests with a small core of leaders, typically, obviously, at the top. And finally, formalisation, the degree to which organisations standardise behaviour by training, rules and formal procedures. Okay, so I will play this in the background, but talk over the top of it, if I can. So this is a Spanish film, so it's got subtitles, so I can speak over the top of it. The only reason I'm going to play this is because it is seriously funny. But one thing I will say about what this illustrates is the degree of bureaucracy to grow and to become a means, an end in itself. So every organisation has to have administrators, and many of you are working in administration. But because of this issue of span of control that we talked about, employees tend to get rewarded by how many people they've got working underneath them. So people with a wide span of control are rewarded to a greater degree as people with a narrow span of control. So this is a job agency. And she's brought the right paperwork. And he's looking for holes in the paperwork.
No ha rellenado esa casilla. Voy a las mesas de la entrada y...
But she's up to it. She's prepared. The other bureaucrats are looking anxiously on because she has tweaked onto the system. She knows how it works. Tension. Look at all this paperwork.
Y la fotocopia.
He's getting serious now. Toothpick comes out.
Tú lo has querido. Fotocopia del DNI. Número de cuenta. Fotocopia de la tarjeta de la Seguridad Social. Fotocopia de los impresos de Hacienda.
Gunfight at the OK Corral.
Doble fotocopia
Battle of the bureaucrats.
16, numerado y grapado.
The stapler. She never got the staple, but he gets it first. Notice he's even wearing somewhat Western clothing. This is fantastic. But she has bought a small stapler. And even her small stapler qualifies as a staple in the world of bureaucrats. He's defeated. Now, I was saying, that what happens is you get rewarded for the number of employees you've got underneath you. And all these employees have to do something, so they create paperwork. And the reality of this kind of system is that it fosters the growth of itself, because the people who you have underneath you, they also need a payroll officer, and they also need to have a health and safety officer, and they also need to have a training officer. And it just grows and grows and grows to the extent that, for example, it's not uncommon for universities now to have one administrator for every lecturer. And you'd think, okay, that means that the lecturers are doing very little paperwork, but the reality is that's far from the case. As much as a third of my time is spent doing paperwork as well, on top of having a whole imaginary administrator standing next to me, working full-time on administrating me. It's laughable, really, if it wasn't the fact that taxpayers' money is being sunk into this kind of nonsense. But this is true of all levels of government, all types of government, and a lot of large companies, but is something that needs to be kept an eye on. So departmentalisation. This is kind of like the organisational chart, the white sheet on the wall with all the different departments and how they link together and who's in charge of what and who's head of what, that type of thing. There are a number of different kinds of chart. The simple chart, which is, basically boss and one department. It's often very flexible. Owner is in charge of basically everything. Then there's the functional one, which sorts employees along with specific knowledge or resources. You'll have people, who handle sales of a particular kind of product, for example, because of their background specialisation. It does start to create the kernel of something called professionalisation, which is something that, for example, it's only in the last 70 or 80 years that really nurses have become fully professionalised. It's only in the last 2 decades where nurses, the professionalisation, the identification with the nursing profession has meant that you have to have a university degree at a lot of levels to do nursing, where it used to be on-the-job training. But so this issue starts to emerge in kind of like a division of labour. And people start to focus on their little neck of the woods rather than the whole of organisation. It does tend to increase conflict because people are looking after their neck of the woods versus someone else's neck of the woods, and people don't suddenly see other people's points of view quite so clearly as they would in the simple method here. Okay. Then there's divisions. Often the traditional has been, you know, the British India Company, for example, had, you know, like arms of its operation or divisions of its operation in Australia or Indonesia, for example. Or they could be sometimes like Nestle, the Swiss multinational, will probably have a baby foods division, so focused on a particular product. There has been a shift away from this geographic focus towards this client-based focus, where, for example, you can have major clients or products as being the way to organise your growing business. This tends to create even more sense of isolation or silos, where really one part of the company starts to compete actively with another part of the company. I mean, you may be producing, as Nestle does, milk for baby food, almost identical product, milk for adults, you know, powdered milk for adults. And this can create, for example, duplication and confusion within an organisation. And this continual shift between a geographical division and product-based division can also cause conflict within the organisation. Now there's quite a modern concept of the team, which in many senses has the origin within sporting world. So you have a large number of people who have different skills but with a single aim. It's often quite a narrow span of control, so, you know, instead of having you know, this tall structure, it's just one person maybe in charge of a little team that's tasked with doing a particular job. It's largely self-directed, self-run. That's some of the advantages, and is not very formal. It's often found within divisional structures, so it's these things can be macro level, can be a division, and at a micro level can be a team. It can be flexible, responsive, quite cost effective, but you do have, you know, skills and training costs, because unlike the Ford Taylorist approach, you need to have a multiple range of skills. There also needs to be a high degree of supervision, which we didn't see, for example, in the Asakura case, where Harry seemed to be getting away with murder, so to speak. Look, the Matrix, I shouldn't zoom so fast in, but the Matrix is quite an interesting one. And it's, if you have a look at this particular example, this is a programming company that makes computer games, and they'll have maybe 3 different products, 3 different games, each which has a boss in charge of a particular game. But then they also have some divisions within their or departments: art department leader, programming, audio, quality assurance. And effectively that person is also in charge of this. It cuts across the 3 different games. So a person within this particular part of the matrix has 2 bosses. He has the project leader of the game, and he's an art person. He does, you know, designs pictures and graphics for the computer game. He also has a art department head, and effectively they've all got CEO as a head. So in one sense, they've got 3 bosses. Now, as you can imagine, I mean, this is quite a neat method of doing things. As I say, it's a good solution where there are 2 aspects of the divisional structure that have equal importance. And it does support knowledge sharing, so the art people sharing with each other, and the games people are also in a group, so to speak, and they're sharing with each other. And it uses resources like the art department resources. You could switch from one game to another. You could be reallocated, you know, from that group into that group. And it's quite flexible as well in that sense. Role conflict. What are you and who are you? Who do you report to? Can increase stress, and who's accountable as well. Can lead to that kind of diminution of responsibility, reduction in responsibility. So finally, the network. It's one of the most interesting and modern solutions. I like using the example of Paul Newman's Own. You'll find it in supermarkets across Australia, but you'll find supermarkets across a lot of the developed world. That company despite its massive presence around the world, has got only 28 employees, which is extraordinary. But what they do is they farm out components of their work all across. They'll have a specialist bottle manufacturer that produces just bottles, and then they'll have a label manufacturer that produces just labels, and they'll have a label applying to the bottle company that just applies the labels to the bottle, etc., etc. And they'll source their pasta sauce from here, and they'll garlic and chili sauce from over there, and they'll just combine it, and effectively it's just a shell company. I don't know. What have I done here? BMW cars, for example, are now made in America, and so you'll find cars are actually quite a good example of this. Increasingly, car companies are shrinking, and they're farming out lots of elements of their work to other firms. It's very flexible. It allows the company to adapt quickly to change. You can switch partners. If you're not happy with the pasta sauce from one company, you can go to another pasta sauce from another company. It is quite a neat little way to operate. On the negative side, the core organisation can be exposed to risk. You can find yourself depending on your bottle manufacturers, your starter motor manufacturers, if you're a car manufacturer, for example. As a supplier company once, a company I was involved with, we were in an arrangement with another company where we supplied home-branded material to them, and they one day just dropped us, and all the goodwill that we generated by creating a quality product that was then, they had their label put on it, went to their new supplier, and as a company of supplying generic products to one of these network-style companies, we were badly damaged by that process. Span of control, I promised I'd talk about that briefly. Napoleon believed that somewhere between 3 and 10, but the new evidence suggests that the optimum average is around 38. But of course that depends a little bit on things like self-direction, how behaviours are standardised, whether tasks are routine or complex. Because, of course, if you've got highly dependent people, you may well have to more closely supervise or micromanage people than if you've got very self-directed, proactive employees. Remember this idea of tall versus flat, just layers of management. Tall tends to cost more, disempower, be sluggish, very bureaucratic. And the flat is got the opposite features. Centralizations, companies tend to be centralized. They tend to start with a boss with a vision, and then they decentralize as they become more complex and more difficult to manage. It's an almost inevitable process. Companies can have some elements, and franchise companies are actually a good example of this, where they're highly decentralized, but the bosses at the different McDonald's stores or the different Pizza Huts do all the hiring and firing. They decide to some degree, particularly when the owners of these franchises, on things like opening hours and things like that, or whether they'll have a cafe or not, and which street they put the building in. But centrally, McDonald's will control things like the brand and how yellow the big M? Golden Arches? That's it, yeah. It's some time since I've been in a Macca's. Okay, and formalization's partly determined by regulation. In Australia, for example, we do have a very big infrastructure of government rules that determine what you can do with employees, for example, and requires you to do X, Y, and Z with sick leave, with providing of safety equipment, safety shoes, training, for example. It's all regulated and stipulated to a significant degree by the government. So some contingencies, organisational design. So if you have a hostile environment, it tends to be fast changing. So organic structures, which we'll talk about in a minute, but organic structures are highly responsive, non-formal structures. However, where situations are very hostile, for example in wartime, you do need to have a very clear chain of command because there isn't time to have a big discussion about things. And that's true of business as well. I should really take you to this point. The organic structures tend to be wider span of control, less formalized, less centralized, and the opposite is called mechanistic structures, where the span of control is tighter, more micromanaged, more formalized, more centralized. It's a good way to think about this field of organizational structure. And mechanistic structures, as I say, they're often associated with well-established companies, while organic structures, there is this, the textbook refers to this issue of liability of newness. Almost all companies suffer from liability of newness, and companies are probably at the greatest danger between the age of 0 and 7, statistically, of collapsing because of this liability of newness, where, excuse me, you need to hire all sorts of new staff during that stage. You need to bed down relationships with clients. There's many different reasons why that early stages you're the most vulnerable. Okay. Another one of the contingencies which we should talk about is the dynamic versus stable environments. Organic structures are better suited to when things are changing. Kind of obvious. Mechanistic structures tend to work well when the conditions are stable. You know, unemployment is low and growth is stable, etc. within a country. And then when the complex versus simple environments, complex environments tend to push decentralization of a firm so that it can adapt to local conditions. The example I gave in class yesterday was the US market. We tend to think of it as exporters to the US market as being a single market. But the US market is many different markets. If you're marketing to New England, you might as well to some degree be marketing to like a part of Europe. If you're marketing to the southern part of California, you're almost marketing to Mexico, and so on. You do need to, in parts of Florida, you're almost marketing to Cuba, and this is partly ethnic, but also there are these, you know, Midwestern mentalities, the southern mentalities, the northern mentalities, the northeast industrial coast. So you've got many different markets within one, and no wonder that you're tempted to decentralize and hand over some power to people who understand those specialist conditions. Diverse versus integrated. Diverse environments tend to require divisional structure. It's a little bit similar point to the issue of complex versus simple. And some more contingencies, excuse me, size, technology and organizational strategy. Larger organizations tend to have greater specialization. They tend to have greater formalization, hierarchies and decentralization. Kind of obvious. The presence of technology has changed the way organizations run. Kind of obvious again, but as a result of IT, we use less formal communication, and there's less of the memo, less of the letter, and more quick flick of you know, sending a text or an MSN message or Facebooking or using an intranet, blogging within an intranet. It's all become a little bit less rigid and formal. It also requires more. Obviously, IT has changed the way we see IT people, and they've become more pivotal components of the way we run companies. But these kind of mechanistic structures work less well now, partly because IT allows a very interesting kind of cross-layer communication to begin to occur. So I may now start to get messages directly from the Vice Chancellor of the organisation through email, where that formerly would not have been possible. So it, you know, the nature of companies has been changed by the presence of technology. Finally, organisational strategy. There's a line in the textbook that says structure follows strategy. the reality is that when you're thinking about setting up a company and deciding on organisational structure, you do really have to pause and think, okay, what do I want to do with this company? Now, for example, if you want to create, the example there's low-cost strategies tend to require mechanistic style, but let's say that your focus was on producing very, very low-cost product. You may well decide on a network structure where you lose some of the advantages of having everything in-house, including being able to look impressive by saying you have 500 staff beneath you and swanning around bossing people. The network structure requires you to become a very good buyer and seller of products, particularly a buyer, and you lose some power by having other companies do key components for you, but it allows you to maximize potentially the low-cost strategy. Or if you want to become a quality supplier who is known for customer service and customer knowledge, you may well want to keep a lot of things in-house so that you can call on that in-house knowledge to deal with clients' demands. All right, 35 minutes, not bad by recent standards. Talk to you next week, eh?